Kate Seal, you have some questions, I understand.
Yes. I wanted to raise three questions. First of all, if you could link, you were discussing the depopulation of Africa, and I wanted you to link that to the issue of when Europeans actually came to Africa to colonize in bodily form, colonize Africa. And the usual mythology is that Africa was not colonized, it was colonized so late, 19th century, as a result, because of the diseases in Africa that prevented Europeans from actually going there and living there successfully. And it seems to me that actually there's something else going on. The depopulation suggests that there was actually no need for Europeans to colonize. And so I wanted you to sort of talk about that issue.
Those are very interesting thoughts. The issue of depopulation is a very difficult one because while in certain areas you actually have declines in population, in general the African population stagnates or grows slightly during this period. But this can be quite misleading. Europe in 1400 has about 20% of the world's population. In 1800 or so, Europe has about 30% of the world's population. That is, you should have expected a very sharp increase in population size, and that helps explain, quote unquote, the rise of the West, that the West is producing a much larger share of the world's population. Now, the question of incursions into Africa, during the 16th and 17th century, the average life expectancy of a European on the coast of Africa is about 6 months. And so the argument is often made, as you suggested, that the reason why Europeans failed to colonize Africa was because of this horrific death rate. But it's also more complicated that the Portuguese, as I suggested in the 17th century, did try to invade Angola and were defeated. So there were some real efforts to colonize, but the political and military strength of Africans was great enough to achieve a kind of, I would say, very unequal compromise. That is, Europeans would remain along the coast, but they would be able to obtain the labor that they were seeking. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah. But I would add they have no interest in colonizing in Africa. After all, what their interest is in getting the people so that the better to colonize the part of the world that they're interested in colonizing. I would assume the interesting question would be to ask, why didn't they plant sugar in Africa? And that is a question that hasn't been seriously addressed. But it is clear that what they need is the population from Africa, the better to exploit the sugar potential of the Caribbean islands. There's a kind of obsession with the Caribbean, or at least with sugar-producing islands in this point, as was mentioned in the first half of the class. So I think that explains the lack of any effort to colonize Africa in the way that efforts were made in the New World.
Second question, conceptual point. You mentioned at various times that this slave trade distorted the political structures, and I'm wanting to raise an issue here with that claim of distortion. It seems to me that to say that it was distorted suggests that African politics, political communities, polities, have a pure, authentic form, versus being always in historical production. That as human societies, we're always changing. Not only African communities and cultures and politics, and political communities, but all around the world. And to say that there was a distortion suggests that there might be a return to some pure Africa, a pure African polity, pure African culture, or a pure African indigenous culture. Whereas I would want to suggest that that idea of distortion is misleading, because what you've been arguing is actually for the historical specificity of the interactions between different peoples of different continents. And therefore, what we would rather see instead of what I would suggest that we frame it as is less a distortion than as a negotiation, not always conducted amongst equals, but a negotiation, and people are responding to each other in different ways, and the results are new forms of polity, new forms of economic relationships with new partners, new tensions, new modes of class stratification, and so forth. The idea of distortion, I fear, leads to the idea of Africa and Africans as victims, sort of being distorted, their political forms, cultural forms being distorted by some greater European power that comes in and has the greater efficacy and more superior in various ways. Although you had sought to address that with regard to the situation of the Angolans, peoples of Angola, being able to military defeat the Portuguese. So I'm wanting to underline that, and maybe either of you have some comments on that.
Let me jump in on that one, because while one recognizes the issue of negotiation, one should not underestimate the issue of power, which you mentioned. And here's a militarily, technologically, in many instances, more powerful groups of people invading another area and extracting from it a significant number of people. I mean, if we take the floor number of 10 million, if you take 10 million people away from any area over the period of time that the slave trade existed, I would suggest to you that there would be some sort of distortion. Now, people may rearrange their life in order to meet that reality, but the fact remains is that that is a reality that has a significant impact. Similarly, your position worries me a little, because one can argue similarly that slavery is a negotiated relationship. If one ignores that there is a significant impact, that slavery had a negative impact on its victims. However, they adjusted themselves to it. And therefore, as we talk about it, if we ignore the issues of power, of dislocation, of disruption, and all those other kinds of negative things, then I think we underestimate the impact that the institution had on the lives of the people who endured it. Although those people may have, in the long run, resisted it effectively, but over the long period of time, they paid a terrible price for having to endure that. And I think similarly, one can argue with the slave trade that although people negotiated, and they were not, as you say, negotiating from positions of strength, but there was a price to pay. And that price to pay, as Walter Rodney and others say, is that Europe effectively underdeveloped Africa, although there is some debate about that. But I think that is the issue, as I see it.
Can I jump in again? I think a point for the class in the long run is the following. There's two ways to portray, or generally speaking, let's say that there's two ways to simplify here, to portray situations of conflict, conquest, colonization, extraction, and political dominance. And one way seeks to sort of emphasize the kinds of injustices that occurred. And I think that's the line that you're taking here. And I don't want to underestimate by any means the horror or the ramifications, the uneven development that occurs. But on the other hand, we have to pay attention to the fact if we might fall into the thinking of making the other victim and denying their agency, denying the agency of people in that. And so my comment is here trying to retain everyone's agency and not to deny that it was not a pleasant situation whatsoever, and that it had
But my position is that one can be both victim and agent of change. In fact,
yes.
Okay. I don't think we disagree on that. I am convinced that historically, I mean, one of the characteristics of when one looks at the history of any oppressed group is that these victims, in spite of their experiences, managed to rally themselves to resist the oppression. in a series, in a myriad of different ways. And I think that is what's important here. So yes, I don't. In the long run, we're not disagreeing.
Right. Yeah. Third question. With the very powerful rhetoric with which you ended your discussion, Steve, the vision of two nations, black and white, of 1840 by the Scottish writer, and you suggested that was an accurate portrayal of the Americas in 1854. Perhaps that was the case, certainly because the indigenous peoples of the United States were not included within that political circle. They had been pushed out. But I think the power of your rhetoric was very good, but I think we need to remember that even within the United States, today that vision is no longer accurate. And when we have a tendency to reduce U.S. ethnic situations to a black and white, when we really, at the end of the 20th century, recognize that it's much more complicated than black and white, with Asian Americans, indigenous Americans, and Hispanic. So that's
well,
a caveat I wanted to throw in there.
I would absolutely agree, and on reflection would second what you have to say. I think that a very interesting question that we need to think about, and not just in this class, but also in a society as a whole, is that discrimination among groups takes very, very complicated forms in our society. That is, in the colonial period, Indians were viewed in certain ways that were negative, but also that were kind of admired by whites. So there was a very complex racial ideology that emerged, where Africans were treated with a very different racial ideology. And so one of the complexities, I think, is to understand how, as new groups become increasingly visible in our society, the complexities of these racial ideologies. Let me give you an example. This sounds very abstract. I don't mean to sound so abstract. It is often the situation, for example, that white men distinguish very sharply between males and females of another group. And I mean, that's, I think, a very striking way that racial stereotyping works in our society. So we have to make a lot of cute distinctions here. So again, I essentially agree with you.
But part of the problem is the fact that America has never resolved this issue of how its black population is to be treated. I mean, it has faced it on a number of historical periods. It has addressed it, and then it has promptly retreated from it, so that it has not addressed what it considers historically its most significant group problem, if you in terms of the dynamics of groups within American society. It resolved what it thought was its native population. It simply pushed them away. It killed them, or it pushed them away, as the case may be. It resolved in its mind in the 19th century its Hispanic population. It sort of pushed it aside. It has always attempted to address, and this is part, I think, of the sort of legacy of that tension that one sees in Jefferson. It has always attempted to address this problem. It has confronted it face on in certain periods, and then it has promptly proceeded to retreat from it. So it is the tension that gnaws away at the innards of the country, and it can't deal with it historically. It has never been able to do it.
Well, I would say that is a resolution. Perhaps not the happiest one we want. However, it is a resolution. Yeah. And it is also something that dominates the scene such that other kinds of ethnic relationships are clouded. But we'll have occasion to visit those through the semester.
Okay. We are very fortunate to have a real expert with us today, and so feel free to ask questions that you have, but I have a few that I'm going to converse with him about. And the first question I thought maybe would be appropriate for us in this course is to talk about comparing the African experience in the United States and its colonial counterpart with Latin America. The experiences were different and similar in interesting ways, and I think we need to think about what those differences were. And to put it in the most crudest way if one was forced to be a slave, would one have preferred to be a slave in Brazil or in the Caribbean or in the American South? Now, the framework for this discussion was developed by a Columbia University anthropologist, sociologist named Frank Tannenbaum, in which he argued that there was a fundamental difference between the way Africans and slaves were treated in Catholic societies and the way they were treated in Protestant societies. And his argument went along these lines, that in the United States, slaves were deprived of all legal rights, including not only the right to be on a jury or to testify in their own defense, but even the right to legally have a family. All those were deprived. He argued that Spanish and Portuguese slaveholders were far more lenient in their physical treatment of their slaves, that they prayed together, they loafed together, they slept together, and that was fundamentally different than in the United States. He argued that the Spanish and Portuguese were far less tainted by racial prejudice than their North American counterparts. And he argued that Latin American slaves were further benefited from the fact that Latin America was not as closely engaged in a modern capitalistic economy geared for maximum production. So, Richard, if I might ask you,
is Tannenbaum right?
Is he right?
That's a question that's still being debated. No, I think there are a number of things one can say about the Tannenbaum thesis, and let me just sort of highlight a couple. One is that there is, indeed, in the Iberian world, so to speak, efforts, and also this also applied in the French system, efforts were made to codify laws about slavery. One can do certain things. One had certain responsibilities as a slaveholder. There are certain things one couldn't do, etc., etc. So laws were enacted that attempted to address the boundaries of the authority of slaveholders. Nothing of the kind, Tannenbaum would argue, is found in the, say, Anglo slave system. So in that sense, then, the existence of these laws ostensibly worked to the benefit of the slave. The problem, of course, is that being 3,000-4,000 miles away from the source of this law, on the ground, so to speak, in the plantation, in the colony, the effect of the law is minimal. Spanish slaveholders or French slaveholders, the French slaveholders in Haiti were notorious for ignoring the Black Code, as it was called. So that on the ground, I think there's little difference in how a slaveholder may proceed to exploit his slave population.
Okay, let me try to pin you down a little further. Okay, do you think that slaves were treated more cruelly physically in the United States, or were more psychologically oppressed than in Latin America?
I don't know how one answers that. I really don't know how one. Let me skirt the answer, beg the answer a little bit by saying, if I look at the experiences of a slave population in the early period of a colony's development, for instance, that period when they're clearing the land, tilling the soil, and all that sort of business, I would say the experiences of a slave in Jamaica after 1655, in the period, say, between 1655 and 1700, when the colony is beginning to emerge as a sugar-producing colony, would be the harshest possible experience of slavery. And that if one looks at the comparable Spanish period in, say, Brazil or any Spanish colony, I would suspect, all things being equal, that the slave experiences would be comparable. That it would be equally as harsh because the demands of labor are the same. One has to get the land cleared, one has to get the crops in. And this sounds all very rational. rational economic man. But I think those are the kinds of ways that one has to look at the comparative slave experiences. So that in the United States, in that period in Louisiana where they are attempted to plant sugar, I would say it would look very much like any other place where they are attempting to plant sugar, give or take.
Okay, let me ask you a few more questions then. In the Caribbean, plantations were much, much, much larger than the United States. In the United States, there was one slaveholder who owned 1,000 slaves. But that was by far the most, and even that slaveholder had a series of smaller plantations. There weren't 1,000 slaves on this one plantation. But in the West Indies, plantations of 200, 300, 400, 500 slaves were not uncommon at all. So would it be better off to be on a plantation with 300, 400 slaves, or to be on a plantation like the typical United States plantation was, that had 20 slaves?
It depends on the, well, I'd rather be on a beach rather than working on a plantation. But it depends, I think it depends on again, on the crop. I know of no experience in whether it is 400, 150, or even 500 slave plantation. Growing sugar as a crop in slavery has nothing to be said for it if one is a slave. It is the most demanding. I always tell a story of, as a teenager, going to a sugar-producing part of Trinidad where I grew up, and seeing an old man cutting cane and saying to him almost, you know, with my chest puffed out, I could do that. And he said, okay, lad, try it. And I think I lasted 2 minutes. It is the most taxing, physically taxing kind of work. So sugar-producing colonies extracted a great deal from their slave population. Tobacco, less so. And so that it, to some extent, it depends on the crop. Now, if one is on a plantation where one has 500 other slaves, there is something to be said for, to its credit, that there's a greater degree of room for freedom and a room for maneuver, because the plantation owner simply cannot take on the business of policing 500 people. So that in the Caribbean you had then, in that sense, a greater degree of freedom for people to express themselves culturally and otherwise. So that the plantation begins to look more like a factory system, in which there are overseers, but the overseers can't control totally the life of the plantation. The plantation then develops some of its own rhythms, and the people are able to express themselves more than if one is under the careful and close scrutiny of a plantation owner that has a plantation in which, or an estate in which there are 10, 20 slaves. Some people have used that to argue the reason why you have a greater survival rate of African traditions and cultures in the Caribbean, because people had a greater degree of freedom to express themselves simply because they could not be supervised with the closeness that existed, say, in the United States.
Okay, Richard, we do not have the Inquisition in the United States anymore, except what we have final exams. But here we do have an Inquisition. And let's follow up on the issue of culture. Stanley Elkins is a famous U.S. historian who argued that the slave trade was so disruptive, and slavery, particularly in the United States, was so severe that it shattered cultural ties to Africa. How would you evaluate that claim?
Again, I think there's some degree of truth in that. Where I part ways with Elkins is over this issue of whether it created what has come to be called the Sambo personality. But I think to some extent what we see happening in the New World is the creation of a culture that I think is Pan-African in its characteristics. People finding themselves in a new situation and in an oppressive new situation. They're unable to express all their traditional cultural ways, draw upon all their experiences and also the experiences of the local people that they come into contact with, to create a culture that is useful to their particular experience. It seems to me that culture that doesn't have a practical application is not really significant. But so that you have in the Caribbean or in the New World generally the creation of a culture or the coming together of cultures that we can call an African American culture that has in local areas peculiar characteristics. So clearly there is something that we can call an Afro-Cuban culture that doesn't exist in Texas. Although there are certain kinds of characteristics that we can see in certain institutions, the church and other things. But I think it's fair to say that the African cultures that we see in America are not the same as let me put it this way, what the people left the ship with is not what they boarded the ship with. And I know you shouldn't end a sentence with a preposition, but I did it twice.
Well, what would be some of the, could you point to some specific examples of these kind of cultural forms that are blendings or new creations in the New World environment?
Well, I mean, if we take, well, it's getting to that part of the year, and for those of us who were reared in Catholic countries, it must be time for Carnival and Mardi Gras, right? Time to party to get decadent before you go back into the bosoms of religion. But here you have in those areas that have been influenced by sort of Catholic Latin traditions, you have the existence of this festival that is part African and part European and has a religious, at least in the original way it was practiced, had some religious characteristics to it, but something that you don't see in any of the Protestant. So that is why one of the things that we were told as growing up is that the Protestants really don't know how to party. But you have a yeah. I mean, it's a tradition that lasts a week. I mean, when I was growing up in Trinidad, people say between Christmas and Carnival nobody works. And then you go into another 2 weeks in order to recover from it. But you have this tradition of Africa and Europe coming together to create something that is uniquely New World. That's why, for instance, when I go to New Orleans, if the minute I arrive in New Orleans, I think I'm somewhere in the Caribbean. It has a unique blend of this African, European, Catholic sorts of traditions. I always remember years ago, my family, we were going on a vacation to South Carolina. And we're driving along, going down to Charleston, and we stopped at the side of the road where the women were selling baskets that have a sort of African tradition, and the Tagula kind of tradition. And I got out, my wife, who is American, and we stood at the side of the road, and I spoke to the woman about the baskets and bought a couple of baskets. And when we got back to the car, my wife said, "I didn't understand a word she said." And I said she was speaking English. But it's the inflection of the voice and the turns of phrases, and so that you have even on the coast of South Carolina, you have a pattern of speech that sounds almost like patterns of speech in the Caribbean. So you have those coming together, so that somebody who was reared in urban America couldn't understand a word this woman was saying, and I, who was a foreigner, who still have to show my green card, could understand what she was saying.
Another example, I think, where one might see a kind of different cultural adaptation has to do with family. The slave experience was very disruptive of family ties. Our best guess is that somewhere between 30 and 40% of all marriages were broken by sale. And the sale of children was much more common than the sale of spouses, so that we're talking about very, very high rates. And one response to this was a very strong stress on the extended kin group and on what are called fictive kin. That is, people who aren't blood relatives, but who can stand in and assume responsibilities.
Scottish kith.
Yeah, and the like many things in American society, it can become trivialized or degraded by Uncle Ben's rice, or aunt. But the notion of an uncle who serves a family function was who was not a blood relative, was extremely important and was a very important adaptation to the disruptive effects of slavery. Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, actually, this is kind of back to culture and religion. I just recently read an article in archaeology about they're finding traces of certain artifacts that denote a tie back to the African religions in these plantations in the South. And I was wondering, white objects found in the northwest corner or northeast corner of a house, kinds of things, is that a specific area African tradition, or is that kind of a Pan-Africa situation?
No, it depends on when in the period that these artifacts can be dated to. In the early years of slavery, those practices are clearly identifiably African. But as the institution, as the years progress, and because of restrictions on the ability to practice those kinds of traditions, they begin to take on certain changes that are less identifiably African and become a sort of synthesis of different types of traditions, all the while filtered through this sort of African law and African tradition. But where you find these artifacts would tell you something about when the house was built, who were the people that lived in it, when they came into slavery, and that sort of thing. But I think what you would see is that it would change over time.
It's interesting, in recent years there's been a tendency to dismiss the term New World, because it implies that there wasn't anything here before, when of course there was. But in fact, I think the concept of a new world is exactly right. That is, for everyone who came here, or was here, a new world had to be created. And it had to be created both out of traditions that previously existed, as well as new elements that had come into collision in this environment. Okay, Richard, I have many more hard questions for you. And the next one has to do with issues of resistance to slavery. All of us remember the moving civil rights song from the early 1960s. Before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave. And it's easy for us, living in late 20th century United States, to assume that we would all be heroes and would risk our lives to overthrow slavery. How did slaves resist slavery?
There's a counter to that, which is that when the older generation is accused of accepting oppression and doing nothing about it, because the young Turks are in full bloom and resisting, that the old folks look at them and say, I survived so that you could resist. And I think it carries an important message. There were many ways that folks resisted slavery. There are also ways in which folks acquiesced to slavery. And I think as we look at agency and we look at resistance, we have a tendency to glorify the oppressed and to say that everybody resisted. Heavens, there are people today who buy into systems of oppression and become mouthpieces for people who are clearly oppressing. And so in that sense, then, one has to temper this urge to find resistant slaves everywhere you turn with the reality that there were some people who simply accepted it, the better to survive. But there were all kinds of resistance. There were people who ran away, created what I think you pointed out in the lecture, the maroon societies. These were large These were areas, many of them still are in existence today in Jamaica. There are maroon societies that still practice their traditions, that were recognized in the 1730s as independent entities or nations, even within a small island like Jamaica, because the British authorities couldn't crush them, and therefore they simply accepted them. It is not until the 1780s, in what was called the Second Maroon War, that the British were able to attack and effectively destroy some of the maroon settlements. But when you go to maroon settlements today, or to maroon areas, they are still practicing some of the traditions that the forefathers practiced. So you had resistance in the form of what the French call marronage. You had, those were runaways that established alternative societies to the plantation economy. And interestingly, though, lived on the fringes of the plantation economy because they relied on it for a number of things. Then you had people who simply ran away, what they were called petty marronage, because simply they wanted to avoid a beating, or they were angered by something that the plantation owner did. You had that kind of resistance. And then you had the massive, organized, sustained resistance, some of which you talked about, the Haitian Revolution, the British Guiana 1823 rebellion, the Baptist War in Jamaica, the Bush Negroes of Suriname. You have all of these forms of resistance that aim to create an alternative to plantation economies. And it is clear that when one looks at the transcripts of court records of people who were captured and forced to testify against others in slave plots, that the slaves had objectives. These were not sort of archaic, spontaneous uprisings. These were carefully plotted, and they had objectives. Very early on, there's a British historian, a man called Richard Ligon, who visited Barbados, I think in the 1640s, 1650s, just as it's emerging into the plantation economy, in which he talks of a slave revolt, and he records that the folks, it not only included the majority of what he calls the servants on the island, but they also had a plan which was to become masters of the island. Now, it may be that Ligon was drinking too much of the rum that was produced in Barbados, but it is clear that for the slaves, the plots were not just simply to get away from the plantation system, but increasingly people were beginning to see that they should take control of this situation, the better to control their lives.
Okay, let me ask you the next toughest question about that, which is why do revolts seem to be more widespread and more violent and more successful in the West Indies than in the United States?
I think you could put it down simply to population differentials. The same sort of situation you talk about. You have plantations of 500 people. Here in the United States, this quickly became a settler, what I call a settler economy, in which Europeans came in order to replicate their cultures in a different sort of setting. In the case of the Caribbean, people are there to make money in a hurry, to go home and enjoy the fruits of their profits. And what you have a great population, what the British call deficiencies. So they even passed laws that attempted to regulate for the percentage of the number of whites that must be there for a certain number of Africans. So that if you went beyond 10 Africans for every one white, you were breaking the law. But of course, again, the law was never enforced because people had to make money. They had to get the sugar grown and the sugar out of the ground. So that in the case of the West Indies, in the case of the Caribbean, these differences in population made it possible for people to organize effectively. And also, they were able, once the organization started, to retreat into the mountains to establish some sort of standard that others could come to, and to make life a little bit more difficult.
Yes.
I have a question. When one looks at the civil rights movement insurgency here in the U.S., the leaders that emerged in my mind were associated with some religious institution. Was that the same in the Caribbean?
Not if you take the comparable period. No.
Two different eras.
It's two different, because I would argue that the reason that the church becomes a pivotal institution, although I have some graduate students who are now arguing, and I think pretty successfully in their dissertations, that the church has been overplayed as an important institution in the United States, that there are some cities where the church did not do anything as an institution to attack the system during the civil rights movement. But in places like the Caribbean, you had alternative institutions. If you look at the first leaders of the independence movements in the Caribbean, they're all the university-trained people who were able to exploit other kinds of institutions rather than the church. I can think of no leader. Now, this is not to say that they don't play on religion in order to appeal to the people, because if you go to a political rally in any Caribbean island, the masters of the rallies are those who can pull the chords of religion most effectively. But those people had alternative institutions. When I was a teenager and all the struggles were going on for independence, we used to call it Dr. Politics. You had to have a PhD in order to be a leader. At least in the case of Trinidad, every one of the leaders, be you pro-independence or anti-independence, had a PhD. It's unfortunate because PhDs don't know what they're talking about politically. But the point is, you had alternative institutions. Not so in the case of the United States, that one area for independent action as an institution is the church. So it becomes very, very important.
Richard?
And as you know, universities are not the hotbed of revolution in spite of what people say. So that you don't have the black colleges, although they do provide the foot soldiers, you don't have the black colleges providing the leadership as the church did in the civil rights movement, because many of the leadership in the black colleges were depending on the state in order to survive. Yeah? You have to go cup in hand to Austin, or you have to go cup in hand to Atlanta in order to get money to keep your institution going. That doesn't tend to make you very rebellious. Yeah? You need a certain degree of independence, and I think that's what the church provided for the civil rights movement. We made a big leap from slavery to civil rights.
But we'll go back.
Okay.
And we're going to talk next about a very important thinker in modern 20th century history named Eric Williams. Eric Williams was from the Caribbean, and he made several very controversial arguments that I think are not of mere academic interest in the sense of unimportant interest. And let's take a look at some of his arguments one at a time. Okay, the first argument that Williams made was that racism was a product of slavery, that slavery preceded racism, slavery generated racism. What do you think, Richard? These are big questions. And,
I would say, no, this is one of those Dr. Politicians, I should add, Eric Williams. I would say that he is correct in the sense that, the racism that we know, the modern variant of racism, is a product of a particular time and a particular experience. And I think Williams is right in saying that the construction of this, of what has come to be the explanation for exploiting and oppressing other people, of people of African descent, in this case racism, is a direct result of slavery, of the attempt to create, to devise an explanation to justify a particular institution. But alternatively, I think it's also correct to say that, as Winthrop Jordan and others have argued, that there were in European cultures, particularly English, the English culture, certain attitudes towards Africa that made it possible for later generations to simply exploit those traditions in order to create this system of explanation that we call racism.
Okay, if racism in its modern variant is somehow rooted in the slavery experience, then why has it survived since slavery, and is there any hope for its eradication in the reasonably near future?
But it takes on a life of its own. I mean, I don't think Eric Williams would even address that issue or would disagree with it. The point is, racism takes on a life of its own and becomes a justification in and of itself. I mean, it doesn't unhinge itself from its historical roots, but nonetheless it takes on a life of its own. And to some extent that explains why it doesn't die with slavery. So that one kills an institution and one doesn't deal with the ideas that justify that institution. And of course, in America, in the United States of America and in other parts of the New World, those, and particularly in the United States, those issues of racism have been the weak point of American institutions, I think, historically. They are the contradiction. There's the great contradiction that gnaws at the sort of vitals of the society. A society that claims equality and freedom for all, and at the same time permits racism to exist, or has it existing at different pitches, at different levels during different periods of its existence. And more importantly, I think, as we were speaking of earlier, America is the one society that has attempted to periodically confront issues of racism and exploitation. It has attempted to do it bold and aggressively, and then similarly has simply retreated. It seems as though it gets to the door of the house, opens the door, looks inside and says, "Good God," closes it and simply retreats. It will not go beyond the threshold, would not cross over.
Sometimes you're an outsider to the society and therefore can offer various perspectives that insiders probably cannot see. One often hears Brazilians talk about Brazil as a racial democracy. Mm-hmm. And one sometimes hears people argue that racism seems to be more deeply rooted in this society than in other societies in the Americas that also had experiences with slavery and large populations of African descent. Speaking as a participant observer, how would you comment on that?
Well, I think in places like the Caribbean and places like Brazil, racism has taken on a sort of a much heavier class set of issues, so that one can see a direct relationship between race and class. There's an old Caribbean, a sort of French patois proverb, which, when you translate it, it goes something like this. It says, if you're black and rich, you're brown. But if you're brown and poor, you're black. Now, I can't conceive of anything like that in the United States. So that the United States has managed to do two things. It has managed to keep both, although sometimes they converge, but it has managed to keep separate issues of race and class. And although racism manifests itself in class terms, Yet, over the broad sweep of history, one can separate the two. In many cases, in other parts of the New World, the two things converge and mix more freely. So that you see a black person in Brazil, it's a good chance that he or she is a poor person, but it's not absolutely the case. And you have then to devise certain kinds of lenses to look at that experience. In the case of the United States, there is clearly, I think, historically, a clearer demarcation between the two, between race and class, although there are points where they also converge.
I think, can I interrupt?
Please.
I think that your depiction of the situation in the United States is not quite accurate, because certainly with regard to the Hispanic community, class is the core definition of race, and we see that also in the black community. Although the prominent black intellectual leadership is always a middle class, and it remains a leadership because although it's class white, in class terms it's become white, and often in order to avoid being understood as a sellout to white, it redecorates itself, fashions itself in a black solidarity. The Dream Team at Harvard, for example. But there's the counterpart to Richard Rodriguez's Hunger for Memory is, of course, the book by the black man who went to Harvard, Bourgeois Blues, right? Who describes also the same, becoming middle class is a whitening of the skin. So I think there is that also.
No, I think I won't dispute that. My contention is that in the history of America, it has managed, although it's like a dance, it does. Class, there are points where you can say class and race converge, but in the minds of Americans, black and white, the issues can always be separated. And so that is why there's nothing that you read, it's almost a lament. You hear somebody who says they live in the most fashionable places of New York, but they were driving into work and some police jacked them up in the car on their BMW or their Mercedes or Jaguar simply because they were black. And it is an experience that they don't understand until that fact hits them, so that it has always managed to do that. By the same token, as I said, in parts of the Caribbean, you have a much clearer convergence of race and class, although it can still be separated and identified, but less so than I think in the United States.
Okay, another argument that Eric Williams makes is that slavery and the slavery experience was crucially connected, inextricably linked to economic development in Europe and economic underdevelopment in Latin America, and especially in the Caribbean. So that his argument was, in part, that the slave system generated so much wealth that it helped propel Europe towards the Industrial Revolution. Yet in the same time, it produced certain developments, especially in the Caribbean, that resulted in long-term poverty. What do you think of that argument?
No, I think he's right. I think that historically that stands up. Because what the Caribbean colonies then become are the producers of raw products, of primary products, and also the markets for the industrial products of Europe. So you take, for instance, the example, my favorite example is the chocolate bar. Now that may strike you as very curious. But you have within, if we take the British Empire, that's how it used to be called before it became something else. In the British Empire, you get the sugar for the chocolate bar produced in the Caribbean, say in Jamaica. You get the cocoa for the chocolate bar grown in Ghana. And you get the chocolate bar made in Birmingham in England. No chocolate bar is made in Jamaica. No chocolate bar is made in Ghana. And yet chocolate bars are sold in Jamaica and sold in Ghana. There's the basis. You have the creation of the industrial output, in this case a chocolate bar, in Birmingham that produces jobs, skilled jobs for people, for people in Birmingham. And you have in the colonies, in this case in Jamaica and in Ghana, people producing the goods that are necessary to produce the chocolate bar. And those people are not skilled workers in the sense, or industrial workers in the sense. So you have then the creation of an international economic order that underdevelops or keeps underdeveloped people at the periphery, in this case in the colonies, while helping to generate development in the industrial countries. And I think the same thing existed. So that in the early years of sugar producing, of slave producing economies in the Caribbean, there were more sugar refineries in London and Bristol than there were in the Caribbean. So that the sugar had to be taken all the way to Bristol or London to be refined and then sold back or sold to other parts of the world.
How do you feel about extending the argument to say that this capitalist production and system of distribution and marketing is actually the creation of poverty, not simply underdevelopment, but the creation of poverty in these places, in various selected places that would otherwise be underdevelopment?
Yeah, well, I think that's a consequence of underdevelopment, because you don't have the creation of the kind of industrial base or the kind of economic base that makes it possible for people to diversify their economies. Outside of some places that have the good fortune to have discovered oil or bauxite, it is still, the Caribbean, for instance, is still a sugar-producing place. Alternatively, there are some attempts made to diversify the economy by bringing in some textile industries or bringing in some assembly plants in which parts are imported from other parts of the world and people are provided a screwdriver and they put the parts together. But you have then the creation, because the local economies are locked into the production of this primary good produce, sugar. There's no possibility for diversification of the economy, and you have then the generation of poverty and the perpetuation of poverty in the area. Yeah.
The flip side of that is that areas that you don't think of as engaged in the slave trade, though in fact they were, like New England, in fact benefited enormously from this slave system. Most of the food that was eaten on the Caribbean slave plantations came from farms in New England or the middle Atlantic states like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Ships that were used in the slave trade were produced in New England. Rum was manufactured out of molasses and sugar produced in the Caribbean. So even people who could feel themselves remote from the slave system could in fact be important parts of it. To give you the most dramatic illustration of this, at the beginning of the Civil War, one of the places that tried to secede from the United States was New York City. Now, why would New York think of seceding from the United States? Well, the answer was simple. Most slave societies, all slave societies, I would argue, fail to produce cities and the kind of support industries like insurance or finance that they need to function. And therefore, New York played an absolutely central role in the functioning of the Southern economy because it provided the various kinds of commercial, financial, and transportation services that were needed to make slavery work. And the symbol of that would be an attempt to try to even consider seceding from the country.
Yes, so you're right. The New England states benefited from, although they abolished slavery, they continued to benefit their connections, their trade and other kinds of connections with the New World. So that's why they, to some extent, after independence, they quickly shifted their focus of attention to some place like Haiti to provide it. And once, of course, the Haitian Revolution begins, they try to shift their focus. This is why Cuba still drives people around the twist. Cuba becomes the premier colony or the focus of colonial interest of the United States in the 19th century, and it has remained so unchanged down to the end of the 20th century.
Eric Williams makes a third argument. One was on race, one was on development and underdevelopment, and the third was on the area of Richard's published writing, and that's on abolition. His argument is that, in short, the reason why slavery was abolished in the 19th century was because sugar no longer paid, or the crops that slaves produced no longer paid, and capitalism had entered into a new phase. What do you think of this argument?
I think that's the weakest point of his argument. I think he's absolutely correct to say the development of capitalism, the development of the Industrial Revolution in Britain at the end of the 18th century provided the wherewithal for the emergence of this anti-slavery position. But I don't think it is correct to say that the one is directly responsible for the other. That is, that folks in England, rational human beings, looking around them, said, wow, well, we don't need the colonies anymore. We should just get rid of slavery. I don't think anybody would argue that. But by the same token, it provided the conditions within which people could start exploring what does slavery mean in a period of industrialization. And of course, there's also a growing religious sensibility about all of these things. There's the emergence of political concepts that are embodied in what we call the Enlightenment. People are talking about freedom and equality, and all of those sorts of things are happening. Slaves are revolting in the New World. Slaves are setting up their own country in places like Haiti. All of those things are happening, and I think put together provide the kind of explanation of why it is folks began to raise questions about the legitimacy of slavery without having to. And plus the fact it's also an imperial relation, and I think that's one of the things that we don't explore too much, because it's possible then for the imperial parliament to pass laws that abolish slavery in the colonies, and the colonies have to they can either accept or they could revolt. In the case of the United States, there's no imperial power to say you guys have to abolish slavery. And to some extent that may explain why the United States resolved this problem about slavery in a way different and unique in the New World.
The United States is a funny country. We're a land of immigrants, and yet simultaneously it's a country that is very provincial, that's very inwardly focused and is seldom aware of the world around it in any serious or sustained manner. But in recent years there's been much more interest in the notion of a black diaspora, of a kind of pan-African identity that's not simply confined to the United States but transcends national boundaries. It stretches from Africa to Latin America to the United States. And at the same time, one thinks back in the past, and there's often been kind of unsuspected examples of Pan-Africanism that Americans didn't understand that that's what it was. The first mass movement of African Americans in United States history was led by a Jamaican, Marcus Garvey. Any thoughts about this Pan-Africanism and its historical roots and where we might be headed?
Let me just back up a little bit and
please.
say that this provincialism that Americans always claim, I always find I'm very deeply suspicious about. it gives them the opportunity, I think, to claim exceptionalism. And there's nothing that is more comforting than to be exceptional and different. But look, throughout the 19th century, Americans of all breeds were going back and forth across the Atlantic. In the 17th century, in the 18th century, you follow immigrants. They're going, one minute they're in Scotland, the next minute they're in Virginia, the next minute they're in Jamaica, and then they're back to Scotland, they settle somewhere else. People move around and ideas flowed, I think. So it may be that we have to start questioning again this provincialism. And we know in the case of anti-slavery that there was an active transatlantic anti-slavery movement that lasted 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. So within that context, I think there's clearly an understanding in the late 18th century into the early 19th century of linkages between people of African descent from different parts of the New World. I always mention the fact that you have immigrants from the Caribbean settling in America. If you take the period after the Haitian Revolution, significant numbers of blacks who were fleeing the Haitian Revolution settled in places like Philadelphia and established a prominent position. You look at the names on the censuses in Philadelphia, all of a sudden these French names appear, and in typical American fashion, there's that box where race is identified, and these people are either black or mulatto. So you have these contacts, and you've had contacts because of those trading links that we talked about. So I think there's a recognizable community that obviously is centered around the eastern United States and certain parts of the Caribbean, as well as Africa, and to some extent across the Atlantic, in this case to London. So you have the creation of a community. Robert Alexander Young, who most probably produces the first political pamphlet in the 19th century by a black American called the Ethiopian Manifesto, has his Messiah, who is coming to save black America, coming out of the island of Grenada. So you have a sense that people are aware that these things are going on. As I think I may have mentioned to you also, in the wake of the Nat Turner Rebellion, you had a letter being written to the governor of Virginia, who warned that there were 30-odd people, blacks, who were training and were armed in Haiti, that were coming there to take up the mantle left by Brother Nat. So you have then this sense of connections, and I think I'm emphasizing the political ones here. But I think you do see also, it also has a cultural aspect to it that we could identify as Pan-African or diasporic or something like that. But this is something that is becoming increasingly of interest to people at the end of the 20th century. So there is Pan-Africanism.
Very interesting.
And I think we have to look at the culture, the cultural aspects of it. Again, would have to. There are two schools of thought, that wage war at the end of World War II, and only anthropologists would wage war like this. One who said there's no African retention, Franklin, and the other who said, Herzkovits, yes, there are lots of African retentions in the New World. So you have this stormy debate between two prominent anthropologists / sociologists over what it means to be black in the New World. And I think Herzkovits may have been closer to the real situation, although I think he overdrew those African retentions. So that the Pan-Africanism has its cultural elements too. And increasingly, I think, in the middle of the 19th century and the 20th century, lots of the cultural and political cross-fertilization of people of African descent occur in the imperial capitals. So that the Pan-African movement has its first meeting in London, and the Negritude movement, which is a uniquely French movement has its greatest activity in Paris. So that one has to see, as you put the Pan-African movement or diasporic movement together, you have also to include within it the centers of imperial power, in this case, London and Paris.
A quick question. We tend to think that modern civilization is a uniquely European phenomenon, and that forms of modern civilization, call them modernisms, which is a specific movement, or modernity, is specifically kind of a white European or Euro-descended thing. And especially when we think in contrast to the question of African Americans, and we think, oh, Africans in the Americas, they have this retention of African religions and traditions, therefore they're traditional, or Indians are traditional with their Indian traditional cultures, and therefore they're not part of modern civilization, or they're not part of modernity. They don't have a modernity. And I was wondering if you could comment on this idea, because this is something that we'll be dealing with later on in the course, to what extent there are many modernities, whether it's color-coded, racial-coded, or what can you say about an African modernity or African-American modernity?
I think that there's, you can identify it. I mean, back in the 1930s, the C.L.R. James wrote what I think is a critical pamphlet of about 30 or 40 pages, in which he argues that these apparently backward people in the Caribbean were ready for independence. Now, this is the 1930s. There's nowhere in the British Empire that you would find any sane, rational person who would think that these backward natives are ready for their independence. And James argues very effectively, I think, that these folks are prepared politically, culturally, and in all different sorts of ways, in spite of what we see as their backwardness, for independence. And interestingly, he hinges his argument on the fact that they are comparable to the Greek city-states. So that small knots of people living in relatively confined spaces have developed a sense of their own capabilities and have had a history of political activity and independence that clearly shows that they are capable of running their own lives. And in the 1930s, people sort of said, well, I don't know. I don't think this squares with historical reality. But I think what you're seeing here is, in spite of, and James is no sort of cultural nationalist, but in spite of what are clearly African-derived traditions, one can identify modern settings. James would argue that the plantation system is clearly, in its time, the most advanced economic organization, the first industrial-type economic organization that European man invented and practiced in places like the Caribbean. So you have, he would argue, the economic basis for modernity, the political basis for modernity, and also, he would imply, although he never argued it, the cultural basis for it. So I think you could see it, one can argue. The only difference, if you argue in the case of the United States, is that James would limit it by saying you have to look at people in small, confined, clearly delineated areas in which they're able to practice these things over time. So I don't know if he would apply what he would argue for the Caribbean colonies to, say, the United States. But I could share that with you anytime you want to have a look at it.
So, in other words, people of color are not excluded from modernity by any means.
No.
In fact, not only part of its rise of what we understand as the emergence of modernity, but are completely always within it.
Yes. James would argue that people of color are as advanced as European man.
The notion of original sin has been out of fashion since the 17th century and the decline of the Puritans, the end of that century. And yet, for the Americas, original sin is very much there. That is, the whole enterprise that we call the New World, the economic development, the settlement of this two continents would have been inconceivable without slavery, and Africans played a vital role in the shaping of New World cultures. Thank you very much.